Oh, there you are. Okay, very good. And it looks like we are live. That's great. Okay, so should we go? Okay, all right. Good morning, everyone. It is Senate Natural Resources and Energy on Tuesday, February 4th. And we are starting today with a discussion about this S29 fluoride contamination reduction program. And we are joined today by a couple of scientists, which I am so excited to have you both here with us to talk about this. And so I assume that we'll just go in the order that you appear on the agenda. But before we get started, we'd love to do a quick round of introductions so that you know who we are. Yeah, so can you start with?
Yeah, good morning. I'm Senator Ruth Hardy from the Addison District.
Senator Kerry Williams from Rutland District.
Senator Ann Watson from the Washington District.
Senator Seth Bongartz from the Bennington District. Scott Beck, California.
And this is June.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
It's okay, our committee assistant. All right, super. Well, welcome. And okay, Mr. Vaughn, are you ready to introduce yourself and take it away?
Yes. Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me. So I'm Matthew Vaughn. I am the Chief Scientist of the Lake Champlain Basin Program. I'm happy to be here, and I was asked to speak about the water quality impacts of de-icing salts for Lake Champlain and its tributaries.
Amazing.
Sound right to you?
Yes.
Okay. Great. I will share my screen if that works for y'all. Hopefully you have a screen in the room there.
Yeah.
Okay. Uh-oh, let me try that again. How's that?
Oh, very good. We got it.
Okay. All right, great. That's probably a familiar sight to all of us here. This is a de-icing, a plow truck with applying de-icing salts here. This is a really hot topic, as you all know. I've done a lot of work on the impacts of de-icing salt along with other pollutants of concern for Lake Champlain and its tributaries. So I'm here just to share the information that I've gathered and the analyses I've done, and I'll answer questions as I can. I'll also mention that a lot of what I'll be talking about is in our State of a Lake report that was released in June of 2024, along with other concerns and the latest data for Lake Champlain. So let's see here. So I think you've had some introduction to the impacts of de-icing salt, but I wanted to start with some basics. And Jared asked me to go over some diagrams of how salt moves through the environment and ways that we impact that cycle. So de-icing salt, in general, what we're talking about is sodium chloride. It's the same compound that you see on the table next to the pepper. And when sodium chloride comes in contact with water, usually it dissolves into two parts, the sodium and the chloride. So most of what I'll talk about during this talk is the chloride piece of that. It's an ion, and it's something that we've been tracking. We have really good data on going back to the early 1990s. So environmental impacts from de-icing salts are common worldwide in recent decades when de-icing salts have become much more commonly used to increase safety from slipping and road safety. And this impacts are widely documented throughout the developed world. It's not an issue that is unique to Vermont or to the Lake Champlain watershed, but we also have seen impacts here as well. So de-icing salts or salts in general can adversely affect all forms of life, including algae, zooplankton, macroinvertebrates, amphibians, fish. And that does this by impairing growth rates, reproduction rates. It just it's a source of pressure on especially our native species that can favor more salt tolerant species or even invasive species in some cases. It also has been shown to reduce biodiversity, which of course is a bad thing for our ecosystems. And related to that, can have physical effects as well, because saltier water is more dense. It can impact the physical mixing of our lakes and water bodies. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that. So now I'm going to show you some diagrams. There's more information here than I think you need to digest, and I'll try to highlight the most important parts, but this way I think you can go back to them and spend a bit more time if you'd like. So bear with me. These are just diagrams I thought were helpful from recent research papers that kind of summarize the impacts of de-icing salts on the environment. So here is kind of a diagram of where road salt goes after it's applied to a road. Of course, it does its job, decreasing the freezing point of water, making it more liquid so that you can achieve that traction that increases road safety. After it does that, it dissolves, and about a little bit more than half goes into our water bodies in general, and then about 40% can go into the ground water. So the piece that goes into the groundwater can impact soil chemistry. It can reduce the pH or increase the acidity of soils. It can impact how organic matter and nutrients move throughout our system. It can decrease how much how much water our soil can hold. It can also cause the flushing or release of heavy metals in the environment. And then after it moves to the groundwater, eventually on a longer time scale, it will also make its way into the surface water. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And then, of course, it can also go directly into water bodies from direct runoff into rivers, streams, and lakes. And that, as I said, I'll talk about it more, but it can disrupt how our lakes mix and how they're stratified physically, which can have water quality impacts as well. So yeah, I want to highlight that, some of the salt will go directly into surface water and some will go into groundwater as well. Here's another diagram showing a lot of interactions across the landscape, but I wanted to focus on how increased salt in our environment can decrease aquatic plant biomass. Macrophyte just means in general, aquatic plant. It can lower the effectiveness of biofiltration systems. So those natural ecosystem services that wetlands and floodplains provide can be decreased by increased de-icing salt prevalence. And then, as I said, it can increase or impact biodiversity or have an adverse effect on biodiversity. Here's the last one I'll show. Actually, there's one more, but that's an easier one. This is just showing how saltier water will sink to the bottom because it's denser than other water. So we have a natural stratification system for our lakes, mostly based on temperature. But when there's increased salinity, that can cause a dense layer to kind of sit on the bottom of a lake and impact how that lake is mixing. And that can lead to a depletion of oxygen in that bottom layer, which can then cause more phosphorus to be released. And as I said, can impact how the lakes are mixing. So there's a physical aspect of this as well in our lakes when it makes its way there. So that was a lot, but this is actually a simpler one that I just wanted to end with for the diagrams. Too much salt is bad for aquatic life and drinking, and that's the takeaway from all those more involved diagrams. And again, if you have questions on any of these, please let me know during the talk or afterward. Happy to talk more. So most of what I wanted to share with you today is data and results from the Lake Champlain Long-Term Monitoring Program. This is one of our flagship programs that's been supported since Lake Champlain Basin Program was formed in the early 1990s. The goal is to say how the lake's water quality and its tributaries are doing, and is it changing over time. And I'm currently in the last phases of completing a research article on the effects of de-icing salt on the Lake Champlain watershed. So I'm going to be sharing those results with you at a very high level and trying to highlight the most important points. So this data, as I said, comes from the we call it the Lake Champlain Long-Term Monitoring Program. And luckily for us, since the very beginning of this program, they were collecting chloride concentrations. Again, chloride is part of that sodium chloride, the road salt component there. So starting in 1991, we have data going all the way back to that point. You can see the monitoring sites here. And the triangles are showing the mouths of our major tributaries. So this is really capturing everything that's going on higher in the watershed. So for example, the Winooski River, that's capturing the signal from the 1,000 square miles of the Winooski River watershed before it enters Lake Champlain. And then the yellow dots give us our lake data. We have thousands of samples from our tributaries and thousands of samples from our lake sites as well, going back over 30 years. Just some terminology. When I say concentration, I'm talking about the amount measured in a unit volume of water. So for chloride, it's milligram. We use milligrams of chloride per liter. So milligrams per liter of chloride, that's the concentration. And that's what's important. If you're a bug or if you're a fish, and you have your own little world within, a cubic meter of water, that's what you care about because that's what's going to make you healthy or unfit fish or reproduce and live your life. And I'm going to get to the other side of this as well, but this is kind of the smaller scale. This is what matters to biota in a stream or in the lake, the concentration of milligrams chloride per liter. So overall, one of the takeaways I found is that chloride concentration trends are widespread in our region or for Lake Champlain. And since 1990, 15 out of 18 of our tributaries had significant increases in chloride. And those range from 41% increases to 163% increases. This is widespread across our watershed. And I'm going to just highlight what we're seeing in the Winooski River for chloride concentration. And I'm going to do something here that a lot of people find helpful. I'm going to hide the data and explain what the graph is going to show, and then I'll remove that kind of the white square and show you what the graph is showing. So if you like this, great. If you don't like it, just say cut it out, and I will stop doing this with other graphs. So the vertical scale here is the concentration, the annual average concentration of chloride. So we have 20 milligrams per liter and 30 milligrams per liter. And then we have decades here. So starting in 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2020. So that's the time scale and the concentration. And this is what we found for the Winooski River. So as you can see very clearly, we have a significant increase in the chloride concentration over this time. Now, these numbers probably, you don't do this every day, so these numbers don't mean a lot to you. So I'm going to try to provide some context. It's the same graph to the right here, but showing you what these numbers kind of mean. So less than 10 milligrams of chloride per liter is what we consider natural background concentration. That's still what we see in very forested areas where there's not a lot of roads or driveways or de-icing salt impacts. So that's probably where this was, before human impacts. 20 milligrams per liter is what we consider the highest, what we might find in a natural setting. So if it's above 20, we consider that's probably an elevated or impacted stream for chloride. 35 milligrams per liter is what we see has widely documented impacts to biodiversity in an aquatic system. So just looking at these first three numbers, you can see that in the early 1900s, this is annual average. So the daily would be much higher or lower depending on the conditions, but annual average, we were below that kind of natural limit threshold. And now we're approaching more than double in concentration for the Winooski River, our largest tributary to Lake Champlain, over that 30 plus years. So that's a significant change in our ecosystem for the Winooski River.
Can I interrupt you real quick? Sorry, we have a question in the room. Go ahead.
So regarding the conditions of the testing, when do you do this testing? Is it done in January when the road salt is applied, or is it done in November?
Yeah.
And do you do it both ways?
Yeah, good question. So this data is collected mostly through the warm months. So starting in April, our teams will go out and start collecting samples in our tributaries. And then it goes through October, sometimes into November. And so the winter season is lacking in terms of the sampling. But what you're seeing here is a result of a modeling exercise where we're taking the grab samples and then relating that to the river flow. And we're modeling what's going on throughout the winter as well. So it would be better if we had it throughout the winter, but we don't have that data available. So
are the sites randomly selected every time, or are they by cross drains or culverts?
What you're seeing here is all data from a single site at the Winooski River near the mouth. It's meant to represent what is going into Lake Champlain for this particular graph.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm gonna show you another example from a smaller stream where you can see how the larger river compares to a smaller, more impacted stream in a minute.
But there's one more question in the room.
Great, sure.
Matt, what happened after 2005 that caused a decrease? Do we have any idea what?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a paper that was published in 2012 that reported a great great news because chloride concentrations were decreasing. And it was attributed to a decrease in the amount of de-icing salts being applied. And there was some data from VTrans that showed that the amount of salts being used was decreasing. However, as you can see, in the past decade plus, we've had another reversal. So this trend of an increase for the first decade, decrease for the second decade, and then a sharp increase for the third decade, we see across the entire region. We see it in the lake. And it's a pattern that I don't have great data to explain, but it does seem related to a management style that was going on during those respective decades. So what I have really good data on is what we saw in the environment, and I don't have as great data on the salt usage and other impacts that could feed into it. We do have some. I'm going to end with some research we have going on, and some of it will hopefully get to that point exactly. All right. Any other questions? These are great.
I think we're good. Thank you so much.
Okay. Great. So this is what I would call an integrated signal, meaning that the Winooski River watershed, as you know, is very diverse in its landscape. It has a lot of forested area, mountainous areas, and developed communities. So it's going to get high, the developed communities typically have higher chloride concentrations because of de-icing salt impacts, and then the forested areas have much lower. And the range of concentrations you're seeing here, again, ranging from 20 to 30 milligrams per liter. And going back to the context here, the EPA chronic threshold for aquatic toxicity, meaning the impacts to aquatic life, especially for fish, are 230 milligrams per liter. So about an order of magnitude higher than we're seeing at the bottom of the Winooski River. The drinking water, there's a drinking water secondary standard, meaning this is for taste, not like our primary standards for human health. At 250 milligrams per liter, the EPA thinks it's not ideal it would have a salty taste. And then the EPA acute threshold for aquatic toxicity is 860 milligrams per liter, meaning that should not be exceeded for more than an hour or so. So again, putting that in context here, we're talking about 20 and 30 milligrams per liter in the mouth of Winooski. But now I'm gonna look more upstream to a smaller water body, Sunnyside Brook. Have you all heard of Sunnyside Brook in your discussion so far?
Yes,
Yes.
it's come up.
Okay. So have you heard about the TMDL? I'm assuming.
Yes.
All right. So I'll go quickly then. This is just an example comparing what we saw in the Winooski River, which is a mix of many different water sources, to Sunnyside Brook. Again, I'm showing you what the graph is going to look like. And now we're talking about hundreds of milligrams per liter. This is a roughly 0.6 square mile watershed, again, compared to 1,000 square mile watershed for the Winooski River. The total impervious surface in Sunnyside Brook is about a quarter of the watershed is impervious and presumed to have de-icing salt application. So this is
Sorry to interrupt you. There's some question here about do you happen to know if the Sunnyside Brook is a tributary to the Winooski, or does it go right into Lake Champlain?
It goes to the Winooski.
It does go to the Winooski, okay. And it's in Colchester, I believe, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, anything else that was, okay. Yeah, down by, I think we mentioned it's by Costco somewhere. Okay, thank you, sorry, please continue.
Okay, that's great, yep. Thank you. So, and also I want to mention the time frame on this graph is very different. We're looking at basically over the course of 1 year rather than over 30 plus years, okay? This is continuous monitoring by Vermont DEC, the Watershed Management Division, in support of the TMDL that was developed for Sunnyside Brook. And this, I've drawn this line on at roughly 230, the chronic threshold. And so you can see you may have heard this, the Sunnyside Brook during this time frame was almost entirely above that chronic threshold for aquatic life. And then also there was several exceedances for the acute threshold where there'd be acute impacts to aquatic life as well. And I have again, from the TMDL, just a table showing the amount of time the acute threshold was exceeded. And you see it was exceeded more in the warmer months. And that's because, like what I talked about earlier, how salt can seep into the groundwater. And during base flow, that's often when we have our highest concentrations of chloride, because the groundwater is seeping into the stream, and that's where the base flow is coming from. And we actually see a decrease in concentration or a dilution during storm events. And you can see, there's some acute exceedances in January and February, but it was much more frequent in the summer months, which may be surprising. And then, as I said, almost the entire time during this monitoring period, the chronic threshold was exceeded 100% of the time. Okay, next I want to introduce another term. So we talked about concentration. That is what's important for a fish swimming around or a bug in the stream. Load is a little bit different. This is the total. This is more on a system-wide level. The total amount delivered to a receiving water body in a period of time. So thinking about the Winooski, what's the mass of chloride being delivered to Lake Champlain? We talk about that in terms of metric tons of chloride per year. And you may have heard similar things about the load of phosphorus over time, similar idea, but now we're talking about chloride. So similarly to when we were talking about concentration, the chloride load trends are that since 1990, we had significant increases in 15 out of 18 of our tributaries, these red triangles. And the increases range from about 2% to 127% increases over that time period. This is another graph I'm going to explain before I show you the data. This is 50,000 metric tons of chloride here, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 metric tons of chloride. And then the same time frame we talked about earlier, going back to 1990, 30 plus years of record. And I'm going to highlight the Winooski River again. Similarly to the concentration story, we have significant increases in the amount of chloride going into Lake Champlain over this time period. So if you look at the early 1990s, the Winooski River was sending roughly 20,000 metric tons. It's about 44 million pounds of chloride every year. And now we have annually doubled that amount. So over 88 million pounds of chloride every year. Now I've done statistical analyses on this data, which show that these changes are attributable to changes in the watershed, because the load can change due to changes in flow. If you have a wet year or a dry year, more or less pollutants can move downstream. But we have statistical methods to kind of tease out that factor and show that watershed landscape changes are what are driving these trends. Okay, so that was the Winooski River.
I have a question.
Great.
Looking at this, and I'm thinking about the fact that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, we were using, I would guess, at least as much salt or more than we're using now. How did it stay so low or comparatively low until 1990? And then that raises the question, is there an element of this being cumulative with that base from all those years of spreading salt without even thinking about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if you've seen data that supports that we were using as much salt in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
All right.
That's
the answer?
Sorry?
That may be the answer then, right? That we weren't? Second.
I don't think so. The road salt usage really dates back to it was introduced in the 30s and wasn't really widespread until the 50s, is my understanding. So I think we don't have great data for this region, or I haven't seen any data for this region, but nationwide, what I've read is that the history of this topic is that road salt application has steadily increased over those decades. And it was really only began in the 50s in any widespread way. The other thing that's really interesting on this topic is that with climate change, we're actually using more road salt because we have air temperatures crossing that freeze thaw threshold much more frequently. So even though temperatures are overall warmer and you'd initially think that you'd use less salt because there's less ice, actually communities nationwide and worldwide are using more road salt, which is discouraging, of course. And then, but the other part of your question is right on, that there is an accumulation over time, and the groundwater is now contaminated with sodium and chloride, or there's elevated levels of that compared to previous decades. And that's why we see, even in the summertime, there can be salt application on dirt roads for management. But in general, in developed areas, of course, that's not when plow trucks are out spreading salt, but that's when we have our highest concentrations of chloride because it is in the groundwater. And groundwater is what's driving that base flow, low flow in the summer and fall. And we have our highest concentrations at that point and the greatest impacts to our biota. So yeah, both parts of your question are really good. And the second part, I think, is right on, that there is an accumulation over time.
So just one more follow-up. So as we're looking at these years, is it then, how much of each year is directly related to what was spread that winter?
Yep. Great question.
So if we had a year magically when we put down no salt, would we see a real reduction in the testing for the next year? Or going back to that notion of accumulation, is it gonna take a long time? Even under those circumstances, we take a long time to purge.
Yep. Yeah, great. So I think there's two things. Great question. I think there's two things to remember here. One is there is a lag effect, I would say, or an accumulation effect that you're getting at that is absolutely there. Where if you're looking at what happened in 2005, it is certainly impacted by what was spread in 2001, 2, 3, and 4. And that's certainly the case. The other piece that's really important for this is what happened during that year hydrologically. Was it a very wet year, a dry year? What was the snowpack like? Not only does that impact what road salt is applied to manage those events, but also the system will be either diluted or more concentrated. And there, in this case, for the loading, what's actually driving these things downstream is an increase in flow. And I'm not getting into the methods too much for this talk, but the dots here are kind of the actual load from year to year that have more influence by whether it's a wet year or a dry year. The line here is trying to reduce that kind of interannual, is it a wet year or a dry year effect. So this line is much more impacted by what's the, if you look at a 5-year window, how much salt is being applied, not really at a single year specifically.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Sorry, there's one other question. Go ahead.
So just for context, the first one you had, I think it was milliliters per liter of water was on that left scale.
Yep.
How much is actually in salt water further downstream? Salt to north ends up in the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is salt water, right?
Yeah, in the ocean.
Yes.
In the ocean, I think it's in the thousands. I'm a freshwater guy, so that's not, I should have had that number ready.
Okay.
But I can, that's something we could easily find out, but it is, I think it's in the thousands of milligrams per liter.
I was gonna say, because eventually it ends up in the ocean anyway, right?
That's right. That's right. Eventually. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I want to, well, I shouldn't say the number because I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it's in the thousands of milligrams per liter, much more salty than what we're talking about here for seawater.
And just so you know, team, we're starting to run out of time for this particular presentation, so I just want to put that on your radar.
All right, I'm wrapping up here, so that's
Okay, you're good.
Okay. All right. Next graph here. This is in Lake Champlain itself. And now again, we're talking about milligrams of chloride per liter. So we have 0, 5, 10, and 15 at the top of the graph. So even lower, when you're talking about the lake itself, we're talking about even lower concentrations. And the time frame we're talking about is back to 1990 again, so 30 plus years. And here, because of the impacts from the watershed, we have increases in the lake itself. So these are driven and kind of correlate with the tributary increases in chloride. And you can still see the question, you pointed out, we have an increase in the first decade, a decrease in the second decade, and an increase again following what came down from the watershed in response to management. The increases in different regions range from 20 to 54%. I didn't have I have the details on other slides, but I'm trying to keep it short for you all. I'll also point out that while we've had steady increases the past decade, here is 2023, where we actually had a decrease, and that's because of all the flooding that we had in 2023. So remember, when you have storms, the concentration of chloride decreases. So this is a dilution because of how much water we had. So the loading of chloride is still high, but it's diluted compared to where all the other water is coming from that's less impacted. So you can see the effect of the 2023 flooding there. As I said, I'll just mention some ongoing research we have. I mentioned the article that I'm wrapping up with a great team of researchers. We have monitoring at Mirror Lake in Lake Placid, New York. We have a study going on to look at long-term trends basin-wide. So I showed you what's going on at the mouths of our rivers leading into Lake Champlain, but you were asking about what's going on higher in the watershed, and we're trying to collect data throughout the entire watershed to get a better hold on that. There's also, I mentioned a bit about how climate change is impacting how much, actually increasing the amount of road salt that needs to be applied. And we have a study to look at downscaled climate models to inform what the future of de-icing salt might look like. And then we also have a study with Middlebury funded in partnership with Middlebury College to look at the sources of chloride in our water bodies, the impacts to macroinvertebrates in our ecosystems. And that's all I have for you. I have more if you have questions on anything specifically. I have a lot that I can pull up, but it sounds like we're out of time. So whatever you'd like.
Great, well, thank you so much. I do have one follow-up question, and that is related to where there's a part of the bill that makes the case to do the testing of the salt level closer to a point source rather than some distance away from a point source. Do you have any comments as to which is either more accurate or more indicative of just anything about the location of testing?
Okay, I would say that's a tough one to answer. I think it depends on what your goals are. If you're interested in seeing the impact of a certain activity or a certain area, then the more point source approach or localized approach would be appropriate. If you're looking at the effect on the overall ecosystem, then a more downstream approach, like what I showed on the Winooski River, would be more appropriate. I'm not sure I can provide a more helpful response without more details.
That even just that is helpful. So thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, great, thank you. So team, we were scheduled for a break at 10:45, but what I'd like to do is take a break, a pretty short break if we could, just now, and then we'll jump into Dr. Henderson's presentation when we're back. What do you think, 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Do you care?
That's good.
5 is okay? Amazing, just a little chance to stretch our legs a little bit. I think that'd be good. So we'll be back in 5 minutes. Okay, we are? Yep, great. Okay, so this is Senate Natural Resources and Energy coming back from a break. And so we are gonna welcome Dr. Henderson to our committee. And Dr. Henderson, you heard our introductions at the beginning? Hello.
Yes, okay, I'm here. I'm trying to understand how to share my presentation.
Just advance your slides. As you normally.
We can
do
see
that.
your presentation on our screen.
If you just want to go through the slides in this form, like that is okay.
All right. And then how do I advance them?
I think you could probably just click on the left, on the side, on each successive slide. I think that would be fine.
For the down arrow.
Or the down arrow, that might work too.
Okay, all right, well, I'm going to give it a shot and sorry for my
No.
lack of ability.
It's all good.
All right, okay, so you're gonna know how authentic I am. Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I begin? If you're all set, just let me begin. My name is,
Go
okay,
ahead.
my name is Kent Henderson. I'm a retired dairy exclusive veterinarian. I am not a lake scientist like Matt Vaughn, who gave such a wonderful explanation. I learned a lot about what I'm going to be presenting now from what he had to say, and I hope I can fill in some areas of concern. I live in the town of Georgia. I serve on the board of directors for the Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds, and I'm the longtime chair of the Friends of Northern Lake Champlain. The Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds is a statewide coalition of some 50 volunteer lake associations, plus many individual lake stewards dedicated to fostering environmental quality standards, to the protection and preservation of Vermont's lakes, ponds, watersheds, and aquatic ecosystems. My testimony today will follow the FOVLAF communications policy, which guides my comments, and they've been approved and supported by the FOVLAF chair and our executive committee. So that's who I represent. That's who I'm speaking for today. Today, I'd like to testify that FOVLAB, that is the Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds, approves and supports the passage of S29 and H86, which are acts related to chloride contamination. And I'd just like to start that with the passage of the Clean Water Acts of 2015 and 19, that the Vermont legislature has supported watershed organizations and lake associations in reducing phosphorus pollution from non-point source land usage. Our focus now is being drawn to chloride pollution, which has been receiving more attention from DEC recently with added sampling and tracking. That's what I'm going to try to build on Matt Vaughn's comments today, is what's happening in the state of Vermont. A strong feature of FOVLAF outreach and educational effort is our Clean Water Projects webinar series. Several webinars have already been held, and their recordings can be found on our website. Just recently, on January 23rd, our second webinar was how to assess your lake's water quality data, and it was presented by Mark Mitchell, who is Vermont DEC's lay monitoring program lead. And Mark provided a series of tables and graphs that show the growing trend of chloride accumulation in Vermont's inland stakes and ponds, lakes and ponds. And this is what has sparked FOVLAB's interest and concern. The other message that we received from this webinar was there is a lack of collected data. And so what I'm presenting is extremely limited. But given the data that we have to date and what we're learning from our neighbors in New Hampshire, it makes sense now to prevent the need for less costly remediation. Another source of information in this testimony will be from Kelly Merrill with DEC, who has been collecting chloride samples in the spring for the last 20 years. This data set is from last summer. Mark Mitchell indicated to me that the 2 milligram per liter baseline at the bottom of this graph is the amount of chloride that's expected from normal sources. And that may conflict a bit with what Matt Vaughn just explained, and I will definitely defer to Matt's description. From this graph, though, you will recognize several popular Vermont lakes that are carrying chloride levels that we are perceiving that are above natural sources, and that chloride could be coming from road salt, dust suppression practices, water softeners, and other sources. There's no health-based guidance for chloride in drinking water, but there are health implications for consuming sodium. Sodium and chloride accumulations in water are often related, since sodium chloride is the most common type of road salt being applied in the winter. The EPA does make recommendations on sodium in drinking water, and that it would be less than 20 milligrams per liter, especially for individuals who are on restricted sodium diets. And you'll see the green line on the right side of the graph. That's for Shelburne Lake, and that indicates that it is at that 20 milligram per liter level. So the drinking water standard for chloride, as Matt shared with you, is 250 milligrams per liter. And that's established by the EPA. And that goes back to 1988 is when that level was established. From DEC's total chloride concentrations in Vermont Lakes Inland Studies of 2024, there are only 2 Vermont water bodies that exceed that 250 milligram level. DEC is raising concerns that this is not an appropriate level of chloride to explain its effect on aquatic species, corrosive effect on highway structures, and private and public drinking water infrastructure. So FOVLAF is hoping that this level can be better defined in the future, and I would definitely defer to Dr. Vaughn's description in the earlier presentation. This box graph shows the range of chloride that's been detected by La Rosa Partnership volunteer collections that were verified for 2023. It's my understanding that the collection sites vary in proximity to the water bodies. And that question was brought up earlier, and that is the case. This can give this committee, though, an idea about the magnitude of chloride from tributaries that are in the watersheds that are contributing to various lakes and ponds. An area that my organization, the Friends of Northern Lake Champlain, collects is the light green box, the third from the left. 4 years ago, acting upon DEC's Tactical Basin Planners request, my local nonprofit, the Friends of Northern Lake Champlain, added chloride to our regular ROSA partnership testing that we've conducted for years for total protein and nitrogen. So, like other collections that are being added, we are getting a growing body of evidence that chloride levels are trending upward in Vermont lakes and ponds. I can tell you the question about where are the collections made. I can tell you that the one we do at the Maquam Shore, we are doing upside from a bridge that goes over a municipal road, and it's collecting a 2,800 acre area that is mostly agricultural use. Another area we collect a little bit further down the lake, we are collecting those samples below the bridge, on the side more toward the lake. And I can tell you that the latter site, we get double, we're getting double the chloride contamination in those as opposed to the ones before it goes under the bridge.
We have a question in the room, if I can interrupt you briefly, go ahead.
Thank
Sure.
you. I just wanna make sure I'm understanding the magnitude of this data compared to the data that we just saw the charts that we were saw in the previous presentation were in the 20 to 30 milligrams per liter. In the rivers, and these are much, much higher, some of them up into, over 100 milligrams per liter. Is that right? Am I reading that accurately?
As far as I know, yes, you are reading that right. The chloride levels here are milligrams per liters, and I'm quite certain that those are the same units that you saw in the previous presentation. And I
Okay.
cannot tell you exactly where these samples were pulled, but it was my understanding that they were pulled from smaller tributaries that are more like further up the watershed before they enter the actual water body.
So the previous presentation was really about what's going in from the rivers, and this is what is actually in the lakes and ponds that already there. What is currently in lakes and ponds?
I think that's the general idea, but I
Okay.
would have to bring in Mark Mitchell from DEC to get the exact locations of these samples. So I don't want to go, I don't want to go too far with this and misspeak. I don't want to mislead anybody.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thanks for the question. If there are no more, I'll move on.
I think you're
Um,
good, go ahead.
Okay, so further evidence that of an emerging chloride pollution problem is provided in this table. And you can find this on the public accessible lay monitoring part of DEC's website. And this is what Mark Mitchell presented at our webinar and helped convince us that there is a growing need to be looking at this problem in Vermont. From this very limited size of collections from popular Vermont lakes, you can see that by the red arrows on the right, those indicate highly suspicious or highly emerging. The yellow indicates a lower magnitude of contamination, but in all of these, there is a growing amount of chloride that's going into these water bodies. And the ones that with the red arrows are Carmi, Lake Carmi, Maury, Shelburne, and Tickleby Naked. And you're going to see these same lakes identified a little bit later. In the spring, oh, wait a minute, I'm in the wrong. This map I'm showing now was provided by Kelly Merrill from DEC, and it shows the extent of total chloride samples. These are collected in the spring. There was a question before about what time of the year. Well, these were spring collections in Vermont inland lakes. And you see all the empty circles on the map. And what that indicates is that there's less than 5 years data on all these small lakes and ponds. The eight lakes and the 8 lakes that are marked in yellow and red, they do have significantly increased total chloride. And I'll read them off. It's Carmi, Caspian, Little, Memphremagog, Maury, Rescue, Shelburne, and Tickleby Naked. And these lakes are sampled more often. That's why they're colored in. And Kelly, who is doing the sampling, is convinced that if more sampling is done in the years to come, that we will find more of it in more increases in total chloride. This is my last graph. Mark Mitchell shared this with me after the webinar, and what it shows is the density of paved roads in the watershed, and it's plotted against the inland lake of those watersheds, and it's plotted against the chloride levels in those lakes. So we're trying to correlate road salt to the lake. So the chloride levels measured in the adjacent water bodies on the y-axis, up and down, and then it's plotted against the concentration of the paved roads on the x-axis. And the really steep line going through is that relationship demonstrates the strong correlation between road salt on paved roads to the adjacent water bodies. On my last slide, chloride contamination in Vermont water bodies is an emerging problem. At its present stage, it could be managed with preventive measures like this voluntary certification program to avoid progressing to a more expensive chloride removal efforts that have been experienced in Adirondack lakes. From my years of veterinary clinical experience working with Vermont farm clients, they always subscribe to the theory that an ounce of prevention was much more effective than a pound of cure. Considering the investment that the state has already made in curing the non-point source phosphorus problem, adoption of this voluntary certification program before chloride reaches the expensive removal phases would seem to be a preferred approach. In closing, I'd like to reiterate that FOVLAV approves and supports the passage of S29 without compromising public safety as it is experienced this morning. That's why I'm doing this online and not in person, but without compromising public safety. This bill addresses the impacts of sodium chloride on infrastructure and water quality through reduced salt application. In this bill, chloride accumulation in Vermont's lakes and ponds will be reduced through development of best management practices for municipalities and commercial applicators, by certification for liability protection, and by expanded monitoring of water salinity levels. That concludes my remarks, and I'd be happy to take any further questions.
Great. Super, thank you. Any questions? Okay, thank you. I just want to say I particularly appreciate that graph of the concentration versus the percentage of paved road, the paved road density. I thought that was pretty interesting. Anyway, thank you so much. It's great to have your support on this. So thank you. And we are gonna no other questions? Okay, super. All right, so we're gonna move on in our agenda to Kim Trombley, the program manager from the Adirondack Action, who is with us digitally. And Kim, I assume that, hello. I assume you did not hear us at our introductions the first time around at the beginning of the morning. So we'll do a quick round of introductions and then we will turn it over to you. Okay, we'll start over here. Senator Hardy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I'm Senator Ruth Hardy from the Addison District.
Hi, Kim, Terry Williams from the Rutland District.
And welcome to the Washington District.
Seth Longworth from the Bennington District.
Scott Van Caledonia.
And this is Nolan, I'm the committee assistant. Great, super, all right, let's go right ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for letting us take a few minutes on your agenda today. We really appreciate it. Greetings from across the lake over here in New York. We were asked by Jared Carpenter from the Lake Champlain Committee to come and provide some expert input on your proposed Vermont road salt bill. And I guess I want to make clear that we're really here just to provide some input on how things have worked on our side of the lake. We are neither in support nor opposed to the bill, but I read through it and it sounds really great. You know, we certainly appreciate your efforts to reduce road salt on your side of the basin, and we're trying to do our part over here on this side of the lake. So first, if I can share my screen, is that okay? I have a few slides to share.
Yeah, please.
All right.
And if you could, at the end of this, share them with our committee assistant Jude so that we can have them to refer back to, that'd be great.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so.
Awesome.
All right. Okay, can you see this?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And apologies, I'm still kind of getting used to, there we go, to Google Slides. Okay, so first is just a quick background on our, and I'm also joined by Phil Sexton. He is our technical advisor for our road salt project. He's with WIT Advisors, and he has over 30 years of experience in sustainable winter road management, both on the the boots on the ground side and also as an advisor. So we really appreciate Phil and his work, and he's going to provide some more technical knowledge during this presentation. So I'm going to give a quick overview, and then Phil is going to take it away with all of the technical aspects, how things have been working boots on the ground here on our side of the lake. And then we'll be happy to entertain questions after we both talk. And of course, stop us at any time if you have questions during the presentation. I'm happy to take them in real time as well.
Great.
So as the committee chair, I believe, said, my name is Kim Tremblay. I'm the project manager with 80K Action. We are a local nonprofit here in the Adirondack Park. We're based in Keysville, which is just directly across the lake. Our mission is really to support both our communities and our environments here in the park. We believe firmly that our communities can't thrive without a great environment, and our great environments can't thrive without thriving communities. We've been involved in road salt reduction for a very long time. Since about 2010, we've been involved in our road salt reduction efforts here in the park. We were part of the committee that spearheaded a comprehensive analysis of road salt in the park around 2018. We created this report called the Roadmap to Reduce Road Salt in the Adirondacks, and that piece of report has really spearheaded efforts here in New York State to reduce road salt. It's really helped us to leverage some funding through the Randy Preston Road Salt Reduction Act, and has really just helped align road salt reduction efforts here in New York State, up and down, from our towns and municipalities all the way up to New York State DOT. As you guys know, the Adirondack Park's really big, so we work across the park to reduce road salt efforts. And a lot of our road salt reduction efforts have also been funded by the Lake Champlain Basin Program through trickle-down federal funding through the EPA. We all know the effects of road salt. They can have serious impacts not only in our environments, but also in our rural communities. It's well documented, and we did a study here in the Adirondack Park looking at private well contaminations. We found that 64% of wells in the Adirondack Park were contaminated with salt because of fluoride salt applications on our roadways. So that's a really huge concern for our rural communities. Most of them are on private wells. I'm sure it is very similar over in Vermont as well. And of course, we know that there's huge impacts to our lakes, huge impacts to our water bodies. These can have really negative impact on fish populations. It can cause, plant die-off on the sides of our roadways. It can cause all sorts of environmental issues, but also just really wanted to highlight the human health aspects of road salt too, that it's not just our environment, it's also our rural communities. So what have we done about it? We've, as an organization, has started a project about 2 or 3 years ago called the Clean Water Safe Roads Network. And that has really been a huge effort to reduce road salt here, especially in the Lake Champlain Basin. That's where most of our funding comes from for this project, is through the Lake Champlain Basin program. So through this network, we've grown from about 5 to 10 towns and municipalities to close to 30 towns and municipalities, and also some private applicators, road salt or road maintenance programs on the private side. We've really worked together to form this peer-to-peer network for idea sharing, for best practices. And this is, again, where we work with WIT advisors to help do our technical deployment of this program. But we found this to be hugely effective. We found the best way to help our towns and municipalities move along the road salt reduction spectrum is to really have them learn from each other, because we can say all the great things we want as experts, but it's really that peer-to-peer network that has been really hugely impactful to reduce salt here in the Lake Champlain Basin and across the park. This is just like kind of our theory of change that we are working on the grassroots level. Then we also have some private or some public outreach efforts as well that are informing the public about how important it is to reduce road salt. We started with our Don't Be Salty 80K campaign, and then have expanded recently to the Champlain Valley for Don't Be Salty Plattsburgh, and just really doing some public outreach about the impacts of road salt to both our environments and also our rural communities, and all the great things that reducing road salt can do to our local towns and villages, including some really great savings we found. And then we're using all of these, this network that we're forming and this public outreach campaign to really help encourage New York State and New York State DOT to also reduce their road salt application. As I talked about our Clean Water Safe Roads Network, we've just really been expanding that these last few years. We've started it, it's just, like I said, a few towns and municipalities, and it's really gained traction and momentum as more and more towns and municipalities implement these programs. So we've grown from about 5 to 10, and now we're at close to 30, which we're really excited about. And then I will now turn things over to Phil with WIT Advisors, and he'll talk all about the sustainable winter management programs, the one that we use here over in the Champlain Basin. And I'll encourage him to talk all about like the great things that have happened, some of the challenges we've encountered, and then also the ways we've overcome those challenges. Take away, Phil.
Awesome. Thanks. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
I appreciate this opportunity. And Kim, thanks. I actually had a similar slide, so thanks for saving me on having to figure that technology out. A little bit of background that may be helpful. First is in my career, I do come from the practitioner level. So I've been a landscape and winter management contractor for over 35 years now. So that dates me a little bit, as does my beard, I suppose. But the other thing, though, is at one time I was overseeing the largest private snow operation in the country, which probably is also in the world. What that means, though, is there was a time when I was the single largest user of this salt on the private side of the industry. So I always like to share that information first, because under my leadership overseeing that operation, I equated to about 1 million tons of salt was being applied during my time there. And so a little bit of this is my penance, because I have to tell you that back in those days, we didn't know that this salt thing was a problem. And there's lots of different ways how salt application is actually being sold on the private side, never mind how it's being used on the municipal front. So that's a little bit of background there. So again, I understand directly what's happening in these trucks, having sort of driven these trucks as well, and then overseen a lot of these folks, hundreds, if not thousands of these folks over the years. The second thing is I was happy to see the legislation because I've been involved with the New Hampshire program really since its inception. So we've been partners with them for well over a decade as they were starting to draft this legislation. So we had a little bit of something to do with it back in the day. But and so at the end of this, I actually have a few questions that I want to pose to you that might be helpful as you pursue this, because I'm sure, as you can imagine, with the successes that New Hampshire's had, they also learned a lot along the way. And there's some things that, if they had to do it over again, you've probably spoken with them, but I can probably give you a little bit more insight. When it comes to this program here, so we do everything and we deploy standards based on these sustainable winter management standards. One of the other things that I did related to the Randy Preston Act that Kim mentioned was I was appointed by our Governor Hochul at the time to serve on the Salt Reduction Task Force. And so I had a lot to do with drafting the best management practices, which is really under the auspices of these 6 standards of policy being measure, calibrate, prevent, analyze, improve, optimize. And happy to answer questions on what those mean. But this could be a 2-hour discussion if you want it to be. I'm sorry, was there a question?
Nope, just that.
Okay. What I'd like to share with you, though, is in our experience working with ADK Action, the Clean Water Safe Roads Initiative, we see a lot of the same things happen all over the country where we work on this, but particularly in the Adirondack Park, and where we work with both towns, counties, and have started working with contractors as well. I would tell you that the one biggest challenge that's consistent throughout really is more culturally driven. So it's a hesitancy, right? And it's a fear of both change and what the potential consequences of those change would be. So I would sort of frame it as, fear. You think about the acronym of fear, it's false expectations appearing real, right? FEAR. And so what is the fear of those folks out there that are applying the salt? There's a fear of consequences of, did I do the right thing at the right time? Did somebody slip and fall? Was there a vehicle accident? I know that some of your legislation deals with limited liability, which I think will help. Think about this though, that if you had to think about the primary drivers and variables, which I've studied for years on this, the primary drivers and variables that drive the salt use really is more culturally embedded. So this will require us to shift mindsets, right? And so that's a lot of what our work does, is just start to bring confidence to the idea that, with some of the change, if you will, and we like to think about it again as shifting mindsets more so than actual change. There's a cost driver. So the benefit of this problem is with change comes savings. Those savings, however, are enabled by an initial investment, right? And so that's a lot of times where the opportunity and also where we stop short, because when people have to think about shifting the infrastructure of how salt's being applied from something that puts out a granular material to something that puts out a liquid material, suddenly there's a cost difference there. So it's upfront investment that then we have to think about, benefit cost analysis of that, which a lot of these towns and small contractors, they just don't have the ability or the resources to do so. And then I think one of the other barriers, if you will, to this is having a choice. And so that would beg the question that I think if you had to start over again in New Hampshire, you might want to think about this question here. Will this be voluntary or will this be mandated? Because I think being voluntary, I think the hope of that is you'll find some early adopters. The issue that I have found is then how do you get over that curve? So at some point, we have to think about if there should be a choice. In our work, I think what we found is it's been a diversity of adoption. So we found the early adopters very on. I think that we're sort of into that middle phase, but to get over that hump, I think that's going to be a big challenge for us too, because there is a choice, right? And so it's just like a lot of the other issues that we see in this country right now. And then I do think liability, that's been proven even in some thesis research that I've done, that it's a driver. I would tell you though, it's not the only driver, right? And so if you go back to sort of some of the questions of whether this is voluntary and how you hold people accountable, I think those are some questions that, maybe we could help answer for you in the future just from experience. Now, on to the successes. The successes have been overwhelmingly confident in that anywhere where we deploy these standards and there's buy-in, we're seeing 50% or greater reduction in salt use right off the rip. What's also happening though is there's a big savings, really for the taxpayer base, because a lot of materials other than salt being used. So I think you'll even see it in your state where there's sand use. There's a huge cleanup cost for all these material uses. So we're seeing municipalities on average saving 6 to 8 weeks of time. Small towns, 75 to 100,000. Large counties are saving $250,000 in this operation. And so I think that's a big carrot for them. And then, lastly, our work, particularly in the Lake Champlain Basin, I'm in Lake George today, actually, where I'm speaking with you. And we have, everywhere we've gone, we've seen, in some cases, 50% reduction now in the stream beds. So it's actually measurable at the water level now. So that's been very exciting in our work. So I'll leave you with that. And if there's any questions, happy to answer. And then happy to, if you want to reach out later on, happy to contact with you.
Great, we do have some questions. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Sexton. Your testimony is really helpful. Where were you the head of the largest operation in the world? In New York State or in someplace else?
No, I oversaw 102 locations throughout the country.
Wow.
Yeah, so pretty much anywhere that it snowed.
Wow, that's amazing. So I wanna make sure I understand your testimony. You were talking about the liability protections and how we're sort of looking at them as a carrot, but it sounded to me like you were saying that they are a carrot, but maybe not as big as we might think they are. Is that an accurate, understanding?
Yeah, it's very attractive. Like in New Hampshire, the way it works is both the contractor and their client is provided this limited liability protection.
Yeah.
What you're going to find though happens is, so again, remember, I'm still a contractor by trade as well, so we all talk. So what happens is I'm the client now. Hey, contractor, thanks for your liability protection, but I don't see enough salt in the parking lot. So so it's great to have the carrot, but we need a stick also. So how do we actually, it's sort of a trust verify system. So within this, I think it's fair to say that we can trust. It's just without any kind of verification, which that program does not have at the moment. How do we know for sure that it's actually working?
Yeah, and so that actually leads to my next question. When we got testimony from New Hampshire, I asked them the question about have they verified the numbers? Can they show that there's actually been an impact on the level of salt in the environment, in the stream beds, et cetera? And they said that they didn't actually have that data.
No, they don't.
And they weren't sure about the impact even on, it sounded like, if I'm recalling, the amount of salt that was using. So they don't really have a verified part of their program. And so I was just wondering what you would recommend in order to verify. Sounds like Mr. Clear. Okay. What kind of verification for, carrot and stick, trust verify would you recommend?
So here's what I've recommended New Hampshire, and I think this is where you're fortunate to, from the get-go, make sure that certain things are mandatory versus voluntary. First is there needs to be more meat on the bone for the training. So it doesn't take very much at all to become recertified. You just have to show up to a training for a day that, provides lunch and a beer at the end kind of thing. So why wouldn't I go? We're not verifying that the information's actually been, or the education's actually been interpreted, right? So where's the test? And again, I'm not a proponent of everything being mandated. It's just that in this particular case, there's an awful lot of benefit being given out without any verification. And so I'm troubled by that. Yeah. Secondly, so I just take it through what our program does. And so very first policy you saw was a measuring policy. We cannot improve what we do not measure. Or that which is measured can be improved. I think Peter Drucker coined that phrase. But my point is, if you're going to apply salt, it needs to be done with something that can actually meter the output, because that's the other fascinating thing to me is this whole salt application, salt supply is totally unregulated. It's unregulated as far as where the supply is coming from. It's totally unregulated as far as how it's being applied, how it's being sold. And it's like asking someone to follow a speed limit without a speedometer in the car.
Wow.
So if we, like everybody asks me now, what's the right application, right? It's like, don't even bother asking me that if you don't have a way to actually know what it is. So tell me if it's the same exact storm, I'll tell you the application rate, but it's not. So like some roads require you go faster, some roads require you go slower. Some storms require more, some storms require less. The problem that we're faced with right now is we're all putting down more just because it's safer to do that. But that more is waste.
So in the trainings, do they go over what the level of application that's required based on speed, based on severity of storm, based on type of precipitation, et cetera?
So that is and should be part of the training curriculum on the content of that training. The issue though then is, so great that you watch some other guy calibrate a truck, now you do it and you won't see it. So again, it's verification that the process is actually being followed. And the way that we do it in our program, so again, we take more of a business approach to this, is like, can we get around everywhere and see that everyone's calibrating all the time? No. But that's why in our swim contracts, for those that are properties that are certified, they are required. So the contract in this case is the standards of policy. They are required to have a salt meter, and we can see when it's calibrated. And then we go out and we perform random audits periodically just to make sure that they even did that accurately. Yeah. And that's sort of been my suggestion is I think everyone's a little bit concerned with, well, gosh, what's an audit process look like? It's like, well, I think it looks like any other one is, if you're agreeing to the certification, you're agreeing to the training, you're agreeing to verify that you understand the basics of knowledge, and then you're agreeing to follow standards of policy and that enable these standards of process. And yes, there is a chance that someone at some point will show up and they're going to do a drop test of your spreader. You're going to show us the calibration, what it's calibrated to, and we're going to verify it. Maybe you do that for one contractor in the whole state once a year. But the point is, it could be you.
Right.
Right.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I think we have another question here.
Yeah, I think you just answered it, but it's almost like you have to, you have to measure what you expect, what you inspect.
Amen.
And if you don't budget the amount of salt that you're gonna purchase, it's almost a supply and demand thing. Somebody has to monitor the amount of, like the state of New York. Does the state monitor how much salt actually comes into the state? You're almost gonna have to do that and get contractors to budget how much salt they need to be able to keep track of what they use.
Right. And even just at a granular level, sir, because that's an awesome way that you said it, is part of our measuring policy is, so the very first measuring policy or standard that you have to follow is measure the lane miles of road, or measure the square footage of parking lot or sidewalk. So I should be able to ask the contractor, okay, on this property, how much salt on average should one application be? They should be able to answer that question. That question is answered based on square footage, and then applying a standard application rate to that unit cost, if you will. So most of the industry is not able to do that right now. And that's why I get excited about legislation, because if that could drive this professional to further professionalize, that's a win-win, right? And it's just good. It just makes good business sense. The other fact of the matter is this: in our program, there's still a lot of per application, time and materials, those types of contracts out there. When you're being paid for an amount, there's no incentive to be efficient with the salt use, right? So
Right.
I just think point blank, and I've been advocating this in New York for years now, is those types of contracts should not be allowed, period.
Pretty good.
I've got a couple of questions. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear about the New York program. So is it just municipalities, or is it private contractors that can participate as well?
Well, it depends on what you call a New York program. For ADK Action's Clean Water Safe Roads Initiative, it's really open to anyone that applies salt. So
Okay.
I'm here working with an in-house operation today at the Fort William Henry in Lake George. But we've worked with large county operations, Warren County, Washington County. We've worked with small contractors that are managing private parking lots. And for us, the swim program, it's been designed really for all stakeholders. We use it a lot with our water quality initiatives, but we do it all over the country, actually.
And one further question. I don't know if you all are the right people to ask of this. I meant to ask about this when we were talking to New Hampshire. Actually, before I go to one question, so with the municipalities and the private contractors that you might work with, it is still voluntary to participate in this program.
In New Hampshire, it is, yes.
So this other question about that I should have asked New Hampshire. I'm wondering about the standards for how salted a surface ought to be for it to be safe. Where did those numbers come from? Was there testing involved to show that, like, yes, this is a safe level of salt, slickness or whatever?
Well, yeah, so let me quickly share a resource hopefully without sounding self-serving. If you just Google Phil Sexton Harvard thesis, it'll come up though. But why I mention this is because we've actually done about a decade's worth of our own research, because there's been lots of different research done on this that show lots of different standards of rates, which is extremely confusing. And so we have pretty good knowledge of what the right rates are, and then that's why we even deploy, not just salt meters anymore, but there are salt controllers, even down to the smallest contractor can purchase now somewhat cost effectively, where you can prescribe the rate that's enabled by ground speed. And then we have different standards of those rates. So New Hampshire has a pretty good chart. I would say theirs is the closest to what I would call accurate on average. And so that's we actually helped revise that one with them years ago.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Any
You're
other
welcome.
questions? I feel like I have one more question, which I think we have time for. How would you compare the Adirondacks program with the New Hampshire program in terms of how far apart are they in terms of standards or training? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they're both good in their own way, right? So I don't want to necessarily be critical.
Sure.
I'm involved with both. I do the training for both, but New Hampshire is show up every couple of years and you get recertified, versus ADK Action. We're continuously involved. Preseason, during season. We're about to conduct a few mid-season review workshops, and then postseason. And then, their grant money that they've acquired is going to metering and control equipment, as well as other salt reduction technology strategy, segmented plow technology, those types of things. So I say that there's, they're sort of putting their money where their mouth is here in the Adirondacks, right?
And I think I also want to clarify too that we're a private nonprofit and we're doing this as a pilot project. So it'd be wonderful if New York State scaled this across the state, and I believe that their intentions are to do something like this across New York State. But we do have that benefit of being a private nonprofit.
Okay.
And so we get funding through, like I said, the Lake Champlain Basin program, along with some other philanthropic donors to run these programs. So like New Hampshire is a state program, so I think in some ways that might be more limited than what we can do as a nonprofit.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Well, and again, I know you wanted to wrap up here. Last point I think then is, for our sake, I think it's a public, the opportunity is private collaboration, right? Because I think where we've been successful, whether we do this, we do a lot of this in New York. We're in South Portland, Maine, up through Maine now with some of these projects, all the way down to Virginia. They've got a huge problem with the Aquaquan reservoir system. We work with VDOT there, their state transportation. Anywhere we go, though, it's making the business case, right? And then having those layers of accountability, both in the measuring and then the verification. I think that's where the magic's been for us. You know, we go as far south as Colorado, everywhere, right? So it's like anywhere where there's salt being applied, you have this opportunity. I think again, we think of it in a bit more entrepreneurial approach, and I think that's where ADK Action has been a great partner, you know, with us, because you know they're the awareness and the funding, and we're really the implementation. So I think it's really a more of a holistic view of this.
And I think providing that local input as well. I think that's where we've been hugely successful, and how the program's been hugely successful is that we've really consciously built in local buy-in as well. And I think that's been one of the huge successes of our program.
Great. Super. Any further questions? Okay, super. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank
Yeah,
you. And I
thanks
will
for
share
having
my
us.
slides soon.
Okay, super. Thank you.
Thank you
Good
guys
luck.
so much for your time.
Okay, all right, so we are going to move to Tim Clear, coordinator, or the TMDL coordinator, section supervisor with DEC. So welcome. Were
Thank
you
you.
here when we did introductions earlier?
I was not.
Oh, okay, let's do a quick round of introductions then. Okay?
Hi, I'm Ruth Hardy, I'm from the Addison District.
Gary Williams, Rutland District.
In Boston, Washington District.
Scott Baumgart, Bennington District.
Great, Scott back calendar.
And
Thank you.
you introduce
I read us.
Just okay, great.
And my name is Tim Clear. I work with Vermont DEC in the Watershed Management Division. So my role there is to coordinate TMDL development, and also I work in the assessment program too. So interpret water quality data as it's collected around the state, compile it, and report on it. You know, a large part of that is determining what waters are impaired, which waters are not meeting standards. So I have put together a few slides to share with you all about the work that I do. I can be very brief, and we can open it up for questions, however you want to work this. Shall I share my screen at this point? So there's. Am I? I am on. Okay, great. So again, I'd like to talk about briefly. I should say my boss was in last week, Pete LaFlamme. I work for Pete, so we work in kind of the same. And you may have heard some of this stuff, and I'm hoping I can put a finer point on any questions that you may have. So I'm just going to talk about what's the status of chloride levels that we see in the state of Vermont currently, and then just touch on the Sunnyside Brook TMDL, which we put together last year, which is one of our more impacted streams as far as chloride is concerned. So it's down here. Okay. Quick word on what chloride is. You probably heard this thousands of times in hearing testimony, but it is toxic to aquatic life, fish and bugs that are walking around in streams when it's in excessive levels. A few unique properties of chloride, though, it is considered a conservative parameter, which means once it's in the environment, it pretty much doesn't go anywhere, and it's hard to get it back, right? So it doesn't react with soils. It goes through soils, gets into groundwater. It's not taken up by iota in any large amounts, so it can't be harvested, and it's soluble, so it can't be filtered. So when it's out in the environment, it's pretty much out there. So that lends itself toward, well, how do we reduce it? That's source reduction, and that's kind of what S29 is really all about, and probably the best, most practical approach. It is currently the most cost-effective winter you know, the icing tool that's out there used extensively, as you heard. So you understand the tension, the balance between water quality and public safety. So here, this graph shows, this map shows what we see across the state of Vermont. Each dot on the map there is where we have some chloride information. First, just want to touch on the water quality standards. We have kind of two levels of standards here in the state. We have a chronic level of chloride in the water itself at 230 milligrams per liter. That's over a 4-day average. So you don't want to exceed that 230 over a 4-day average. And there's an acute level, 860 milligrams per liter, which you never want to see anything over that. That's for 1 hour. That's really kind of, that's the upper end acute that does some pretty serious damage right away to the aquatic biota. So on the map, going from the bottom to the top, 8 milligrams per liter, and then between 8 and 50 milligrams per liter. You can see those gray dots and the open circle dots across the map. We have very good coverage of where we have chloride data. Those are relatively low numbers. The yellow dots represent concentrations where we have data between 50 and 230 milligrams per liter. So 50 is on there for a reason. The standard is at 230, but the 50 is where our biologists are telling us this is where you start seeing impacts with the aquatic biota. So the standard may not even be as protective as it needs to be. And EPA is in the process now of revising that 230 number. I get updates here and there. Not sure where it's going to land. It's likely to be lower than the 230. The 230 is where we're at currently, but we're seeing impacts. Our biologists see impacts around the 50 and above. Also, that could be in flux. EPA recommends the standards and then we adopt. So we don't change that until we go through the process.
It's good.
So the lines on that map are those all the counties?
Those are the major river basins.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And then moving up the orange between the two standard numbers of 230 and 860, you can see the concentration starts going in around the Burlington area, as one would expect. And then we have a few sites where we've actually measured above the 860, so that's pretty extreme. But again, most of this we're seeing as one would expect in the most dense areas around County. What do the tributaries look like? Here's an example. Maybe Matt Vaughn went into this a little bit too. He spoke this morning, but some long-term data we have in the larger rivers. You can see the concentrations on the left-hand side there, 5 to 25, well below the 230 standard. But you can see the Winooski, the Lamoille, and the Missisquoi River from top to bottom. What's going on in this long-term data? So this is pretty good data. You can see the Winooski. This definitely has the highest concentration, and there's a definite trend there. Definitely seeing it, and this is from the mouth of these rivers before they enter Lake Champlain. Less so the Lamoille and Missisquoi, but seems to be some trending there in the last 15 years or so.
Question.
Sure.
I have a couple of questions. So I asked this question earlier. I'm not sure if you were in the room yet about, seems like the levels in the lakes and the ponds are higher than what we're seeing in the rivers. And is that because the chloride is settling, kind of like what Senator Bongartz was talking about? It's the accumulation effect of the chloride over many years, whereas the rivers are.
That can be true. It depends on the hydrology of any given pond.
Okay,
Sure.
but what the levels that we saw from somebody who was from the, can't remember where he was.
So Vermont Federation of
Lakes and ponds, yeah,
Just caught that right.
much higher than the 25-ish.
Right.
That it was more in the.
And we have some lake data too, right? And I have some data
Okay.
that I can show.
And I also just wanna make sure I'm understanding, I think we've had this point before, but basically chloride, once you get it, it's in water, you cannot get rid of it. It is just there, like
That's
you
right.
can't filter it, you can't, it
Right.
doesn't bond to something that you can take it out. It's unlike phosphorus in that way.
Yeah,
that
those-
It's just there, we can't get rid of it. So
that's right.
the
You
only
could
thing we can
do,
do is reduce what's going in.
generally true, you could do a very expensive reverse osmosis, but that's not practical in any situation other than perhaps drinking water.
Entirely. Okay, and I had a third question, but now I can't remember. That's it. The EPA standard. I
Yeah.
mean, I think we, at this point, probably can't rely on the EPA
Who knows what's gonna be coming out of these in the near future.
There's one more question.
So back to something that Senator Baumgart brought up, about the chart where it showed over 50, fifties and sixties. It had something to do probably with development too.
Sure.
And impervious surface, the runoff seems to be a lot more highly concentrated in the areas where it's urban area.
Absolutely, that really is the bottom line, and we can calculate that, we've modeled where we see higher concentrations. And one of the main drivers is impervious surface area salt, and that's just pretty obvious. So we can map where we would even expect to see higher.
I remember my other question. Somebody mentioned wells and that they're
Sure.
starting to see it in wells. Is this something that we're testing for in?
My
well
group
tests?
is surface waters and not wells, so I'm not really aware of, we have drinking water program. And they may very well have information on that, and so that's more of a sodium issue, but rock salt is sodium chloride, so. It behaves a little differently, but I think that the health concern is on the sodium side, but the chloride side, but they come together through rocks, so they originate from the same place.
Interesting, thank you.
Florida lakes, and then, this is where we have seen even just one data point, so, between the 50 and the 230 there is the lakes. We have a pretty good extensive lake data set. And this goes back 20, 30 years. The yellow squares, you can see where we have collected data between 50 to 30, and then the 230 to 860, there are a couple tiny little ponds that receive a lot of runoff that are above that level. So most of these ponds, just from what I know of them, are pretty small. But each one is really different. It's like how deep is, how much water does it hold? How long does it take for it to flush out? Does it flush out completely in the summertime? How does the groundwater interplay with these things? So each one is unique. There's some generalities, of course, but we're not seeing as much in these ponds as we are in some of the streams in the Burlington area. And again, this is Lake Champlain data too, and maybe Matt touched on this also. The main lake, Mallett's Bay, is what lake top to bottom. Again, with that trend in the last 15, 20 years, this is Lake Champlain, it's a lot of water, a lot of dilution, but you can see the concentrations on the side, 5, 10, 15. We're not anywhere near the impairment stage, but it's a concerning trend.
Another question.
Tim, I know at least one of those ponds up there is a water source for a town. And I can't remember from the earlier slides, can water treatment facilities filter the salt out, or?
Not without some more complex, probably expensive treatments.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
The routine treatment that you're seeing at drinking water facilities today would not be touching fluoride in this situation, or sodium.
It makes me think about the same issue that places along the coast have of just the ocean, right? Like it's really hard to take ocean water and make it drinkable because
It's a lot
salt.
of energy.
Yeah.
To take all that salt out.
Capital investment.
Yeah, right, salination.
So yeah, this could have a major impact. Small towns, the only drinking water supply. So the streams that we have identified as impaired, we have 8 where we've really documented, we've got all the information, and there's some similarities here. Relatively small, few square miles, for these 8 that we have. Focus in Burlington area. So these 4 columns to the right are the percent of the impervious surface, or the percent of the surfaces that get salted. Who owns them, or who do they belong to? So you can see the state roads for these 8 streams, you're in single digit percentages. So this is V-Trans roads, right? Single digits up to 10% perhaps. Municipal roads, these are the towns. 25% roughly, or 20 area, you can see for these 8. And then we have private roads and the other page. So the other page would incorporate big parking lots would be the lion's share of these things. So this is upwards of 67%. So state roads, that's a single entity, that's V-Trans. Municipal roads, that's a single entity that you're dealing with. The other page, who knows, right? The previous gentleman started, private contractors, things like that, so we don't really know what's going on. Quick touch on Sunnyside Brook. We did some calculations of Sunnyside Brook. Map here, you can see it's a small watershed, very developed. 24% of the impervious, or 24% of the area receives salt. Or could receive salt. We don't exactly know how much, but surface that would typically be salted. So we calculated how much to be protective, how much did this stream receive over the course of a year to be protective of that 230 standard. Again, it's 230 standard, which may be a little high anyway. So this graphic is pretty complex, but just to boil it down, the green line shows the chloride loading across different flow levels of the stream. So left, you've got during high flows, each dot along that green line, that's how much stream can absorb to meet standards. High flows to the left, low flows to the right. The red dots and the black line going through them, we measured chloride in this stream for a year. And you can see how much, the green line would be the 230 standard. You can see how much that we measured in that stream. It never went below this. It's probably one of the more highly impacted streams, so I would kind of want to look at it. And this is over the course of different flows too. This is when it's receiving precipitation runoff, more on the left side of the graph, but also on the right-hand side, summer low flows when you're not seeing runoff, but it's in the groundwater already. So the groundwater is creating flow in the stream. So this indicates that groundwater already has a lot of salt in it. That's been accumulated, at least over the year. We don't really understand the groundwater dynamics all that well yet.
Another question?
Sticking on the box here, but if every residence that has a well has a water softener that uses salt,
That's right.
could that be contributing to it? Because most of that gets put into the wastewater treatment facility, right?
Absolutely. That could be an issue depending on the watershed. Sunnyside Brook, everything's sewered.
Right.
So it goes to the treatment facility and it goes to the big river. But it isn't the source. It's considered a source, not in this watershed, and not you would need the people on wells usually are using water softeners, but it is a source. It's a consistent source. We just determined that road salt really is the driver in situations here. So for Sunnyside Brook, right, 122 tons of fluoride, or that's about 200 tons of road salt can be applied for winter season. That's what we calculated to stay within the boundary. Now, you can see the composition of the watershed on the pie chart. Again, what we kind of went through the state roads, municipal roads, and the other paves, really a lion's share there. Where's the salt coming from, and how do we know where it's coming from? Well, it's
They're paved,
yeah, that's kind of parking lot situation.
Wow.
Yeah. So if you're familiar with the watershed, this is Costco, you've got gas stations, you've got supermarket, you've got
strip mall land.
Yeah. And that's kind of what we're seeing up in that area. So these streams are pretty hurt. The state roads, how much is V-Trans putting down? Well, they actually know. They have GPS on their trucks and they know how much salt they put down. The municipalities, and I'm sure you've heard from or will hear from them, they know how much they use in a year in their town, but they don't know how much in any given watershed. So it's really hard to do a balance when you're looking at a specific watershed. And then the private vendors, nobody knows. We don't know how much goes on there. The only way we know how much is put down is what we measure in the stream. And another point, the last point I want to make, it's extremely variable, as folks know, winter to winter to winter. So it's hard to say, use 122 tons some year, that might be fine. And we looked at the V-Trans data, they stayed within their 13% share 1 of 4 years. They probably doubled it 2 years, and then another year they used 4 times that, calculated amount. So it really depends on season. So it's hard to track. That's my point. it's hard to track improvements in a watershed because the application rate or need for salt is so variable. So you'd have to put a lot of resources in a given watershed to track, are we making progress? Because 1 year it's very high, 1 year it's very low, so you need a long-term data set to try to find trends. So that complicates matters as far as the accountability and seeing if you're actually making progress. I know some of the questions previously there too, is how do you know it's working? Well, it's hard to track. You can track how much they use in a given year. Applicators. If you're working in a watershed context, they need to know what watershed they're in, or somebody needs to know where they're doing what they're doing. And that's data, that's as well.
Can you also track over time? I mean, I know time means you need time, but over 10 years and you sort of average the severity of the winter and say over this 10 years, we use less salt than the previous 10 years because we had this program.
You could work with some understanding of variability that would include, that 10 years becomes a longer term trend where you could probably see some.
And there must be some kind of modeling you can do to sort of bake it.
Well, what's nice about chloride though, if you know how much you're putting in, you can kind of presume that it's gonna end up in the stream.
Right, it's because it doesn't go
Exactly,
away.
it doesn't really go away.
Say, okay, we're putting this much in, this is gonna happen.
Right.
So how much,
Yeah, so you can measure it in the stream.
how much less we would need in order to reduce the levels. I guess those the levels in the lakes wouldn't reduce because it would just end up there. Might reduce in the streams because they're.
It would respond faster in the streams. You would see that change probably faster in the stream than in the lakes where some lakes don't flush for several years. So you get accumulation and then, it's a little like, you can model it. But you need to model it, gotta make sure we measure the right thing, so. Just thoughts that we can do it.
It sounds like New Hampshire's not really doing that.
That's my understanding too. I have spoken with them about what they do. It's like, how's it working? And they're like, oh, we really don't know. You can take samples here and there. It's really hard to define a trend. You need time and some serious resources to get that. Unfortunately.
Questions? You're at the end of your.
I am done with this. Yeah, I was here just if anybody had any other questions in this kind of realm. More than happy to.
But does DEC support the bill? Or
I don't
suggestions?
think we have a position yet,
Okay.
unfortunately,
You're not allowed to say.
It's not my place to say. I know they're considering it,
Yeah, okay. So sounds.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries. Well, thank you so much. Any other questions?
Thanks.